McLaren has ended the year with arguably F1's second fastest car, but among its weaknesses is a strange phenomenon that we very rarely see. This showed itself over a disastrous Las Vegas Grand Prix weekend that went a lot worse than it should have. The MCL60 wasn't to blame for the shock throwback to the team's miserable start of the season that was a double elimination in Q1 as McLaren bungled its tyre strategy in qualifying. It also wasn't to blame for Lando Norris's heavy crash at the start of the race, as low tyre pressures and a full fuel tank, plus maybe a slight misjudgement from Norris, meant he lost control over a bump. And it wasn't to blame for the mix of circumstances that meant Oscar Piastri's valiant attempt at a recovery drive was thwarted by needing a late pit stop to avoid being disqualified. But even with a clear run, McLaren wouldn't have been on its recent podium scoring form, because this was just not a track that played to the MCL60's strengths. In fact, it exposed a weakness besides the one we often talk about when comparing McLaren to Red Bull. It's well established now that the team needs to overhaul its mechanical platform by revising its suspension to build on the obvious aerodynamic gains it's made this year. As we explained in a recent video, although McLaren is trying not to talk about that, we know it's a priority for the off-season. But even though McLaren has been very effective at adding downforce to the MCL60 this year, there is one set of conditions that can still trip it up. McLaren reckons its car's aero just switches off when running in a low downforce configuration like was required in Vegas. So what does that mean? Well, in simple terms, the McLaren just isn't as competitive when everybody switches to a low drag setup. Every car will lose performance to a degree at a low drag level, but it's a matter of how large that phenomenon is, and McLaren admits it seems to be slightly higher for its car compared to a lot of rivals. Since its performance turned around with the first major upgrade in Austria, we've seen a clear difference in McLaren's competitiveness at the 3 tracks demanding a low drag setup. Some cars, as we'll explain shortly, simply have a better baseline for these kinds of tracks. Others have developed better bespoke packages for those circuits. The process of developing the car at low downforce and drag levels is not as simple as coming up with a mega skinny rear wing. A lower rear wing level tends to mean the same on the front. Reducing load at the front wing reduces the control of the front wing wake, which changes the behaviour of the car. McLaren team boss Andrea Stella also says that while the car's overall aero efficiency drops with lower wing levels, it does not happen in a linear way. That means there comes a point where the efficiency decreases more than the pure downforce levels. That means to achieve competitive levels of drag on low downforce circuits, McLaren has to sacrifice more performance in the corners than its rivals do. And while that can be clawed back as part of front-to-back adjustments of the car's aerodynamics, including the floor, this has not been a McLaren focus in 2023. That's why Stella says, ultimately I'm not very surprised because we haven't done any development at this downforce level. But there's a contrast on the grid that shows just how big the performance swing can be in the other direction when a team gets it right. While McLaren tends to struggle more relative to the opposition as it drops down the downforce range, the opposite is true for Williams. The Williams FW45 is reckoned to be the car with the lowest overall level of downforce on the grid. Therefore, it stands to reason it will struggle more at high downforce tracks, and accordingly the Williams was most off the pace in dry conditions in Spain, Hungary and Qatar. It was closest to the pace in Italy and Las Vegas. However, this phenomenon is not only down to the fact that as soon as rivals move off high downforce levels, Williams can match them in terms of aerodynamic load. That's an obvious benefit for lower downforce cars when going to such circuits, but there's more to it than that for Williams. The team's own analysis indicates that it gets stronger relative to the opposition as it drops down to lower rear wing levels. That means it's disproportionately better in lower downforce trim. The reasons for this will lie in the subtlety of the design, but even Williams doesn't completely understand why it is so much stronger in this kind of trim. Effectively, this means that at lower downforce levels, it achieves a higher level of aerodynamic efficiency. That will tell the team something about its design approach, but it's not entirely clear exactly what the reasons are. Williams' head of vehicle performance, Dave Robson, suggests this will lie in the methodology of its rear wing design and also the wider aerodynamic approach. While it is true that drag increases with downforce, the relationship between the two is far more complicated than that. Drag is not simply unwanted aero load when you're on a straight. Vortices generated by interacting airflows are used to improve car performance, but in a straight line they represent drag. And with the regulations introduced at the start of 2022 making the aerodynamics far more simple, it's more difficult to manage drag-inducing vortices than it used to be. For example, the complex rear wing end plates we used to see were partly about achieving that. For a team like Williams, understanding what it's doing that others aren't will be crucial for ongoing car development. That's not just because it will ideally want to retain that strength, but also because it could point to the design methodologies that lead to these characteristics, possibly ones that you would want to trade off in order to have a more effective rear wing for higher downforce. It could be that McLaren's going through a similar process to achieve the opposite. McLaren and its drivers have always said they would rather take the downsides of these specific races where the car is less competitive at low drag than not have developed the rest of the car so aggressively, given what it has been able to achieve the rest of the time. But this is clearly something that needs to be addressed on the 2024 car as a priority, with Vegas offering a timely interruption of McLaren's strong late-season form. You might remember earlier this year that having starred in the rain-affected part of the Belgian Grand Prix weekend, McLaren was on for a shocker in the dry at Spa. After back-to-back second places, Norris was having an absolutely miserable race because he was a sitting duck in a straight line, a consequence of McLaren not having an appropriate rear wing. Its focus on turning around a miserable start to the year and addressing much bigger problems with the MCL60 meant forgoing a bespoke low-drag package. McLaren was able to ready a fairly simple solution for Monza, which at least avoided a repeat of what Norris experienced at Spa, but the car was still not as competitive there as it was elsewhere. In Vegas, the pattern was repeated, despite McLaren having another upgrade. The team brought 2 car updates, but only used the new rear wing flap, which it knew would not really be transformative. It was described as a minor improvement in efficiency that did not change the personality of the car. So it was effectively a standalone part. It just reduces rear downforce. It does not work as part of a package that gets the floor to work better at low downforce. McLaren opted against running its revised beam wing, which would have meant even lower drag. This was because it felt the car needed to have a bit more downforce to cope with the low grip conditions in Vegas. So based on what Stella says, we may infer that the car's weakness meant doing what Red Bull did, committing to a skinnier beam wing and rear wing flap combination just isn't an option at the moment for McLaren. The team knew Las Vegas would be a bit of a struggle because of that, and that's why this becomes a high priority item for 2024, alongside the slow speed weakness that McLaren yet again referenced in Vegas. Teams can't get away with only producing a Monza special low drag package for 1 or 2 races anymore. Tracks like Baku and now Vegas as well mean a significant chunk of the calendar puts a big demand on aerodynamic efficiency and straight line speed. Between that and the team's known slow speed corner weakness, McLaren cannot afford to just muddle through the tricky tracks and wait for Silverstone and Suzuka to flex its muscles, not if it's serious about challenging for wins and championships.